All right, everyone, welcome to section 2 of the urinary system, where we're going to take a deep dive into what was mentioned last time, the nephron. Your nephron, as mentioned, is the structural and functional unit of the kidney, meaning this is the smallest possible component where filtration is going to take place. The nephron itself is actually a microscopic tubule. So think artery, vein. It's a nice little tube that, as you can see in the diagram, kind of ebbs and flows in its own way. Each kidney contains about 1 million of these nephrons. So, two kidneys, we're talking about 2 million nephrons. If you only had one for whatever reason, injury, illness, donation, you would be able to survive with those 1 million functioning nephrons. Your nephron sits within the renal cortex as well as extending into the renal medulla. So it begins in the outer layer of the kidney, but it will extend down and into the renal medulla, so that inner middle layer. It filters blood in 3 separate processes in order to pull out waste and therefore form urine. When we take a look at the nephron, there are 2 major portions that make up the component parts. First is your renal corpuscle, followed by your renal tubule. The corpuscle is really that nice ball-like mass that we see in the beginning, and then the renal tubule in this diagram is all of that nice kind of tan material that weaves off, similar to honestly what I always look at and think of like a roller coaster. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerulus, which is surrounded by a Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus, before you think, what the heck is she talking about, really is just the capillary network from the artery located inside the nephron. So it's that nice mass of that arteriole inside a surrounding network known as the Bowman's capsule. Your glomerulus also is what will filter water and solutes out from the blood. The Bowman's capsule, like I mentioned, is an extension of the renal tubule that will surround the glomerulus. It adds in additional protection, and it allows that water and solutes to be pulled out of the blood and have a place to actually go. Your renal tubule, which extends off of the Bowman's capsule, will then take all of that filtrate, since the renal corpuscle is the first site of filtration. That filtrate, as mentioned, continues into the renal tubule because it moves out of the glomerulus and into what surrounds it, the Bowman's capsule. Your Bowman's capsule has 4 overall parts: a proximal convoluted tubule found in your renal cortex, so that outer layer, the loop of Henle, which is going to be found in the middle layer, the renal medulla, the distal convoluted tubule, which is back out in the outer layer or the renal cortex, and then finally the collecting tubule, which allows us to form the renal pyramids. All parts are surrounded by peritubular capillaries. So in some of the diagrams you'll see there's a nice network that weaves outside of this tan tube that we saw a couple slides ago. The reason for this is they receive materials that are reabsorbed into the bloodstream. So anything, again, the body wants to hang on to, it's going to throw back into blood once it's been cleaned. Blood vessels of the kidneys as a whole, we've got blood flowing into the kidney via the renal artery. Remember, arteries are going to bring oxygen-rich blood away from the heart. And they're going to branch into smaller and smaller vessels until we get blood flowing into the glomerulus from those arterioles, the smallest possible tubes off of the artery, to begin the filtration process. Blood will then be cleaned and then will return to the body via your renal vein, and that arises from the peritubular capillaries. Similar to what we saw in the heart, we are going to continue to color arteries red and veins blue. This typically means that they are oxygen depleted. In this case, oxygen was not exchanged necessarily in the filtration process, but we still are going to color it blue, as you can see in the diagram below. When we form urine, It involves three steps or three overall processes. First, that glomerular filtration, which occurs in the renal corpuscle, or that nice ball in the beginning of this nephron or tube. Tubular reabsorption, where we're going to pick back up anything we don't want to lose through urine, which will happen in the renal tubule. And then tubular secretion. This will also occur within the renal tubules. This is where we throw everything back into urine that we want to get rid of. So we're going to make sure it doesn't end up in blood. We're going to filter it to the body. We're going to get it out of the kidney, store it in the bladder until the micturition reflex begins. Glomerular filtration. Say that 5 times fast. Anyway, it occurs when blood pressure forces plasma and dissolved substances like small proteins out of the glomerulus and into the Bowman's capsule. So we're actually going to remove everything from blood and get it into the glomerulus. Blood cells as well as larger proteins will still remain in what we know as the blood tissue. Plasma is then known as renal filtrate. That all takes place here. So that outer layer we see is your Bowman's capsule, and that network on the inside of that nice little sphere or globe, the glomerulus. Step 2 of the filtration process, tubular reabsorption. Again, this is going to take place from the renal tubules and into your peritubular capillaries. 99% of filtrate is reabsorbed into blood, meaning 99% of the stuff that was pulled out to, quote, clean it, we want to keep and maintain in the body. So we're not actually going to allow it to become filtrate and then become urine. The last 1%, however, is what is in fact going to be sent out of the body, known as urine. Tubular reabsorption is where most reabsorption occurs in that proximal convoluted tubule. In fact, about 65% of tubular reabsorption will happen in the tubule. Useful materials are transported into the blood through active transport. Remember, active is the key word here if we think way back to chapter 3 before life got, online and chaotic because of coronavirus. But active transport means that energy is required by the body to perform this function. It also means that we're getting things moving from areas of high concentration, not to low concentration, but instead low concentration to high. So at times we could be moving against the stream. Think those salmon swimming up. This includes things like glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and positive ions. An amount is removed, but the amount is always determined by the threshold level of the tubules, which means there's a limit to how much can be removed, or a cap. Hormones like aldosterone will allow for the reabsorption of calcium and sodium, so that's CaNa ions, as well as the excretion of K, otherwise known as potassium. Tubular reabsorption, we also see, rather than just mentioning positive ions, we see negative ions. These are going to return to the blood after the reabsorption of positive ions. So they're kind of like you playing with magnets. Once one moves, we're going to see the movement of the other. This is because of that attraction of opposite charges, right? Opposites attract. Water reabsorption, on the other hand, is influenced by the release of an additional hormone known as ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which will occur via osmosis. Remember, osmosis is the movement of water, and we're always talking water from high concentration to low concentration. No energy is needed here. This will follow the reabsorption of minerals. So minerals take place first, similar to the fish example, right, or the salt or the dissolved substances. Again, back in the day, chapter 3, water is going to follow the materials to dilute it. So once those materials go, water will then follow because of osmosis. Small proteins are then absorbed by means of pinocytosis. So we looked at this term again back in the day. This means that they're simply too large to pass through the cellular membrane. Therefore, they need vesicles or doorways or vehicles to bring them into the blood. So they need to be grabbed onto and allowed in or allowed out. No proteins are therefore found in urine. In fact, if proteins are present in urine, that's typically a sign of renal, or in this case, kidney problems or failure. Renal is the term that we give when we're talking about a problem with the filtration of blood or the overall kidney function. So you've probably heard of renal disease. We're talking kidneys. This tubular reabsorption all takes place here. So we have moved outside of the Bowman's capsule glomerulus, and we're talking the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the collecting tubule or the collecting duct. Last but not least, tubular secretion. Substances are actively secreted from your peritubular capillaries and into filtrate. So what's going to become urine? Waste products is what we're talking about. Things like ammonia, creatinine, hydrogen if we're too acidic, and as well as the products of medication or vitamins, for instance. If you are taking a multivitamin but you already have sufficient amounts, then that's going to be removed from blood. Urine is then carried through the renal pyramids to the minor calyx, followed by the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, and then into the ureter, the bladder, and then eventually out of the body through the urethra. Tubular secretion only is going to take place in that collecting tubule or the last part of the nephron. Now, I'm assuming we all know of someone or have heard again of this renal disease or renal problems, and this could lead to dialysis. Dialysis is going to take the place of the body's normal function because there's something wrong with the nephron. So if the nephrons aren't functioning, the person would then have to manually filtrate them, and dialysis is able to do that. What you're looking at down here at the bottom is someone hooked up to the dialysis machine where blood is actively removed. As you can see, there's a pump. You've got dialysis solution with both a blood side and a dialysis side. Again, ions or materials are going to move based on active transport or osmosis like we saw. And then down at the bottom, if you kind of follow those nice little tubes, we've got expended dialysis, so what was used. We've got a constant temperature to make sure that that material, that liquid, is normal body temperature, as well as fresh dialysis material and compressed air, as well as carbon dioxide to make sure that these things are moving. So the radial artery is where we see blood removed, and then the femoral artery typically is where we see it placed back in the body once it's been filtered. Lastly, I know this is a lot of information, but I've provided for you a nice link for those of you that would like a different view of all of this, since we're going to kind of be throwing all of these pieces together. As mentioned, and as I will probably mention through conferences or through Zoom, you are going to be quizzed on both the nephron and the kidney. We're going to throw all of the information together, and you will have access to the nephron diagram. Otherwise, if you have any questions, as always, please make sure to reach out. Otherwise, happy 18-2, everyone.